It would be wrong for me to say that this video is going to bring up anything new or anything that hasn't been said by others, if not by myself, over the years, but this is a very important and a very interesting and rich issue. So it's one that I think is eminently worth returning to. As much as I may hesitate to do that, as much as I realize how futile it often is to make any headway, I still feel compelled to do so. It's cathartic. And you never know. Sometimes you can actually help to persuade someone or help someone else to persuade someone. So, in that spirit, I like to go through what I consider the four largest and best arguments for gun control. Now, the first one is an attack on the Second Amendment and more broadly the Constitution. It is argued, quite plausibly, I might add, that the Constitution is very old. It was written in the late 18th century by people who were culturally and technologically vastly different than we are today. And that as a result, we shouldn't take it for granted that everything that they have written is automatically correct or optimal or that's best or a good idea in this current society. And I have to say that I agree with that sentiment. There are certainly people who put the founding fathers and the document into some kind of religious significance, the founding fathers mythos, that they're great men, that they're very wise, and that whatever they said, whether it was right or wrong, that we should just accept that. I think this is a pretty rare opinion, but it is one that exists, but it's certainly not one that I share. There's many critiques that I could make and would make of the Constitution. In fact, I think there aren't that many people out there who would be a stronger critic of the Constitution than me by and large. However, to say that it's antiquated or old doesn't necessarily mean that everything in it is incorrect. It's insufficient in terms of argumentation to say it's not perfect and then jump to a particular conclusion. If there are problems with the Constitution, it's important to be able to explain why. It's not enough to say Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner and therefore everything that he wrote is wrong. At best, that could mean he is wrong about slavery, but anything that's not directly related to slavery, he wouldn't necessarily be wrong for that reason. So it takes a lot more argumentation to go from the Constitution is old to then it is wrong in everything. What is it wrong about? And also, even if it's wrong, that doesn't imply what the correct solution should be. If we want to say that the Second Amendment is antiquated, that does not logically follow that the solution is to regulate guns or to ban guns. We might say, oh, well, because of current technology, there's no need for a military at all. Or maybe the militia should be unregulated as opposed to well regulated. Or maybe there's literally an infinite number of things that could be said. And to say, well, it's wrong, therefore my position is right, does not really pass muster. That's, in fact, not even an argument. To point out that there's a problem and then not really explain why your solution is better is not a good idea. Now, I think the Second Amendment is one of the parts of the Constitution that largely makes sense. But to say that the founding fathers, and without even attaching any kind of moral superiority using that name, to say that they got everything right is, I think, obviously wrong. But I think this is something that they maybe were onto something with. But it's not enough to say it's an old document. And it's very interesting how selective the people who cite this are. They'll say this, well, the Second Amendment is clearly wrong, but the same people who wrote the Second Amendment wrote the First Amendment. And you don't have people going around saying, well, the founding fathers never imagined smartphones and computers and movie screens. That was a time when you had printing presses that were operated, manually. This is in the pre-industrial age, with type that you had to manually set and whatnot. And you don't hear anyone advocating that when the right to free speech only extends to these things and nothing else. It's taken for granted. People don't say that the Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and Tenth Amendment all are obviously should be destroyed and gotten rid of because of the antiquarian nature of the people who wrote it, even though that's exactly the same critique for the Second Amendment. And they also don't say, well, the founding fathers, it's one thing to say, well, they only imagined muskets and single shot rifles, which is, I guess, not exactly historically correct. There were multi-shot weapons at the time, although I think they were pretty cost prohibitive and rare. But side point, um, given their skepticism of government, wouldn't it follow then that maybe the police should only have muskets and single shot revolvers? Why is it assumed that the implication of this advanced technology is that people shouldn't have it, but government should? Again, there is no logical reason to pick one or the other if the extent of the argument is to say this is an antiquated document. Um, I'm all for critiquing the Constitution and finding problems with it, but to simply say that it's old, or to simply say that the people who wrote it had cultural values that no longer apply, uh, therefore everything in it is wrong, that doesn't logically follow. Even if we want to say that everything in it is wrong, that doesn't logically imply what solutions should be brought forth. All right, so this, I think, is not even really an argument for gun control. This is an argument against the Constitution, but not for gun control in particular. So again, I think that part of the reason this happens is because so many gun rights supporters will point to the Second Amendment as a crutch. It's widely viewed, both in the legal field, according to the Supreme Court, and to many Americans, that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. That's the interpretation I think is the only one that makes sense. But there again, I'm not coming up from the point of view that the Constitution is a holy writ that can't ever be changed. But to simply say that, I think that many proponents, because of their emphasis on the Second Amendment, instead of having to make an argument in favor of what they do, they simply cite the Second Amendment, and then you get the gun control people saying, well, Second Amendment doesn't count, it's not an argument because it's an old document. Again, that itself is not really an argument for gun control, though. That's an argument against the Constitution. Okay, so the next argument that I hear a lot about is you don't need a gun, or maybe not a gun, but maybe a specific type of gun. You don't need an assault weapon, for instance. That's the thing people say the most, or an AR-15. Um, this is philosophically, it's a very interesting kind of point. Um, Obviously, in the physiological sense, it is true in pretty much all, with maybe a few exceptional circumstances, correct. You don't need a gun to live. You don't need a gun to procreate. You don't need a gun to survive. Um, but this caveat could be added to almost everything in our daily lives. In fact, I saw someone post this on Facebook who posted it as they were flying to Iceland to go on vacation. Well, guess what? You don't need to go to Iceland on vacation. You don't need to fly in an airplane. You don't need an automobile. You don't need a computer. You don't need a smartphone. You don't need running water. You don't need plumbing. You don't need any utilities. You don't need electricity. Humanity survived for many thousands, if not millions of years without electricity or any of these things. You don't need books. You don't need athletic teams. You don't need gym memberships. You don't need, all this stuff is ostentatious, not only within the world today, but historically. It's incredibly ostentatious. It's opulent beyond the dreams of avarice of the most wealthy people 100 years ago. You don't need any of those things. It is not an argument for gun control to say you don't need something. Just because, again, the burden of proof isn't on the person who wants to use something. You can't say, well, you don't need an iPhone, so you shouldn't be able to have one. That's not an argument to say they shouldn't be able to have one. This is at best a statement. And there's a lot of things that guns, are, they have uses, and whether or not people need them or not is very much derived from their values. Um, you don't need a gun to keep yourself alive unless you're in a survival situation or you're using guns to hunt, something like that. And people could always say, well, you, in this day and age, you don't have to hunt. There are people who, it's very rare, there are people who find themselves in that situation. Um, but again, to say that they don't need it, you don't need most of the things you have, that doesn't mean that they should all be banned. It doesn't logically follow that they should be banned. This is at best part of a larger argument, where you might be able to say, well, you shouldn't have a gun, here's the reason why, and a gun rights supporter might respond, well, no, I do need a gun. So even though there's a compelling reason to ban them or restrict them, there's a more compelling reason to keep them. You're basically anticipating that and saying, well, there isn't a compelling reason to keep them, therefore they should be banned. No, if there isn't a compelling reason to have something, that is not an argument for banning or restricting it. Uh, the there's definitely a problem with prior restraint here, where you're going to someone and saying, you can't have something unless I approve of you having it. People's ability to dispose of their property and their lives is not limited by your imagination. Now, to kind of address this, even though I think this is yet again not really an argument for gun restrictions or gun registration or gun bans. I think this is a statement that might help in a debate against pro-gun people, but it would not actually be an argument for gun control. But to to anticipate that people can use guns for legitimate purposes, and they in fact do on a regular basis. They can be used for recreation, for shooting, and this is probably the number one use of guns. The number of times that bullets exit the chamber, the barrel of a gun, almost always, probably over 99% of the time, it is going to be directed at some type of target recreationally, whether it be a paper target, a steel target, an artificial groundhog, or just a stump or a rock, uh, or a clay pigeon, or any number of other almost always inanimate objects. They're going to be used for that. And there is nothing illegitimate about any of those activities. None of those activities harm anyone else. They don't do any damage. Yes, there are risks associated with them. Hypothetically, if you are shooting recreationally, something bad could happen, but this is exceptionally rare. There are risks attendant with anything that you could buy. There are risks attendant to playing video games and to driving a car, or to fishing, or to swimming, or to going to the gym. I know people who have hurt themselves very seriously at the gym. This isn't an argument to say that they should never be allowed to do that. Um, People do use them for hunting. That is probably a more philosophically and ethically complicated issue when you start talking about animal rights, but it's generally considered okay to butcher animals. It's generally considered okay to do it on your own, and indeed, much could be said about the health benefits of doing this. Uh, Again, that is kind of its own thing, but after recreation, hunting is probably the number one use of guns. The third use, which is maybe the most important but maybe the least practiced, is in terms of defense. Now, this is something that many people who favor gun control um, uh, try very hard to ignore, but people actually use guns for self-defense. Now, there is a famous, or rather infamous, study made called the Kellerman study, which stated that the chances that you kill an attacker with a gun are many times less than the chances that you kill yourself with a gun, or that you're killed by your own gun is really what it said. So, like, hypothetically, it wouldn't be you killing yourself, but maybe someone would take your gun and kill you. Maybe not a robber, but maybe a spouse. Now, this study is very, very infamous. There's a lot of problems with it. It was very narrow. It took only a small bit of time. And philosophically, this is also not really an argument to say that a gun is more likely to kill you than an assailant. Is not an argument against using them. It's a utility argument, but it's not something that says it should be banned. If someone says, well, I'd still like to take the risk, it's very hard to say, well, you should not be allowed to do that. However, the main problem with the study is not really a quibble, but it's a fundamental problem. It's in the wording of the study, which is that defensive gun uses are only counted when the assailant is killed. So, yes, you may be much more likely to be killed by your own gun than to kill an assailant with a gun. However, the vast majority of defensive gun uses do not involve the lethal end of the assailant. In most cases, a gun is used defensively simply by brandishing. Some type of an assailant, whether it's on the street or breaking into your home, the potential victim brandishes a firearm, and the assailant, upon realizing that there's a firearm in the possession of his intended victim, leaves, usually very quickly. This is in the overwhelming majority of cases. Beyond this, there are cases where the intended victim will maybe fire a warning shot or fire a shot and miss. These shots almost never impact human flesh, and those are also cases of successful self-defense that were not counted by the Kellerman study because they did not result in the death of the assailant. Then you have a large number of times where the assailant is shot but is only wounded. Again, if you are assaulted by someone and you pull out a gun and shoot them, and they retreat or are no longer able to attack and are hospitalized but don't die, they're merely injured, you have been protected. That's definitely a successful use of a gun in self-defense, but it would not have been counted in the Kellerman study because you didn't kill your assailant. Now, there's a lot of underreporting of people who use guns in self-defense, especially when they brandish. When you brandish a firearm, there's usually very little point in reporting this to the police. Technically, a crime has not been committed, although actually sometimes brandishing is illegal, so the intended victim might actually be guilty of a misdemeanor or maybe even a felony. I think it depends on the state of brandishing. The criminal is not going to report it. Yeah, hello officers, I was going to rob this person and he pulled out a handgun, I ran away. He was brandishing a weapon, please go and arrest him. That is a type of phone call that probably never happens, or if it does, it's only a small minority of the times that it actually takes place. Likewise, the intended victim is unlikely to do this. Anecdotally, these are the types of stories that I've heard. I've never heard of someone that I know personally who has actually shot someone in self-defense. I have heard of people brandishing guns in self-defense, and there's many stories, say during the civil rights workers doing this against the Klan or unwelcoming Southern communities, and this is the main problem with the Kellerman study. It ignores probably 95 or 99% plus of defensive gun uses because they don't result in the death of an assailant. Gary Kleck, who's probably the premier criminologist in this field, has been trying to estimate this. He has lots of empirical data. The most recent studies that he's done are from 2015, in which he's estimating that defensive gun uses number in the 750, 760,000 per year, which is a number that dwarfs the number of homicides, suicides, and woundings with guns. It's a huge number. And you might not like that number. Maybe you, and I've seen many people say like defensive gun uses just never happen. You can spend the rest of today, if you like, going online and watching actual video of this happening. Now, it's only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of defensive gun uses that are A, recorded on video, B, have those recordings are made public, and C, that you'll be able to find. So you will be only looking at this tiniest, tiniest sliver, but you can spend the rest of the day today, tomorrow, and the rest of the week watching instance after instance after instance of a private citizen using a gun defensively. And if you tally those private citizens up, you will find very quickly numbers that are much larger than the numbers who are shot, say, in mass shootings or any of these other high-profile events. Now, if you don't want to spend your day looking at that, if you'd rather not see it, if you think that's something that you're just not interested in seeing, I'm not one to tell you what to do with your time. However, don't argue in bad faith and pretend like this doesn't happen. It does happen. And admitting that, it's important, if you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis, to assess how often that happens. It's not enough to say it's super rare, it never happens, or it's an infinitesimal amount, or it must be. That's your assertion, but there's been actual empirical data that's been collected on this, and there's been multiple studies. Kleck is not the only one, although he's had many detractors over the years. When they've done their own studies, when they've done the actual empirical work, they tend to narrow in on similar numbers. So even within the margin of error, we're talking about this being used quite a bit. So that is definitely something that you need, or potentially could need, to protect your life. So again, the need argument is not an argument for gun control. It's an argument that disputes the utility of guns in certain situations, and that may or may not be true. You know, I think a lot of gun control supporters straw man gun rights people a little bit and say, well, a gun is no guarantee. Well, absolutely, that's correct. Guns are not magical force fields. The possession of a gun does not make you invincible. It doesn't mean that you are necessarily going to win in any shootout. The likelihood of how successful self-defense is going to be is very, very dependent on the circumstances. If you're in your own home and you are dealing with a similarly armed assailant, you have pretty good odds. If you're in a mass shooter situation where they're much more armed than you and it's very confusing and it's very dark, well, it's very hard to say. I mean, maybe you can get the jump on them, maybe you can't. We can't say beforehand. However, Having the option to shoot back is always good. All right, to say that you should not have the option at all, that it's always the wrong case, that it's always better to be defenseless, I think is an uh, untenable position to take. So again, I don't even think that, like the Constitution argument, this is not really an argument for gun control. Um, this is at best a statement or a critique of something that is the beginning of an argument, but not a sufficient one to take it anywhere. So the next one is uh, actually an argument, the kind of attempt to demonstrate that the wide-scale ownership of firearms definitely causes crime. So it's one thing to say, well, maybe you do have a right to defend yourself. Maybe you do want to use a gun. Maybe you should have the right to own property, and you want to own a gun. However, if there's a negative externality to that, if that causes a risks to everyone else around you, and those risks are very high, maybe you should be restricted anyway. Again, I think if you're going to restrict someone's rights, if you're going to tell them that they can or cannot do something, or that they must do something, or that they'll be criminalized for doing something that they would like to do, then the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that it's actually justified in doing that. You can't just go, I have a hunch, I have a feeling, I have a phobia, ergo you must obey. Now, gun control proponents feel that it's almost axiomatic, all right? That this is almost something that does not need to be debated because it's obvious that if you have more guns, you're going to have more gun-related crime. And if you restrict guns, you're going to have less gun-related crime. And so therefore, restrictions, whether they take the form of bans or uh, registration or background checks or restrictions on type, these without question could cause a reduction in crime. Uh, and the piece of evidence, so-called, that is cited is to compare the United States to other countries and say, oh, look, these countries have strict laws, low per capita gun ownership rates, and they're very peaceful. The United States has high per capita gun ownership, and it has high crime. Ergo, there's a causal relationship between the two. Now, while there's a certain amount of intuition that's involved in that, it is fundamentally based on the correlation equals causation fallacy. There's many different factors at play when we're talking about things like crime or things like homicide or gun violence, or the inverse of those about peace and accord and um, tranquility. These are very complex social phenomenons, and they don't have singular causes. Uh, Now, it's all very well and good to go and look and compare with other countries, but to do it scientifically, you can't cherry pick. You can't engage in special pleading. So the argument goes, look at the United States, but then compare that to the UK and to France and Germany and Sweden and Luxembourg and Liechtenstein and Japan. Well, all these countries have very strict gun control laws, and they have very low homicide rates and very low gun homicide rates. So the solution, the explanation most obviously is that the United States' loose laws are are causing the high crime. The problem is that that's a very small data set and a very selective one. Um, I can make a very strong argument that there are other countries that are better warranted comparisons with the United States than, say, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Sweden, or Norway. Like Mexico, for instance. Mexico shares a border with the United States. It's economically heavily integrated with the United States. They have parallel and largely similar histories. They're large populations. Mexico, I think, has over 100 million people, which means it's much closer in population, both in absolute size and in admixture, compared to, say, Norway or Sweden or Denmark, these very small countries that have small populations and are essentially monocultural, at least largely have been monocultural, and it's does not. It is a compelling argument can be made that maybe Mexico deserves to be compared to the United States more so uh, than these small homogeneous societies, and not just Mexico, but we could say Argentina, Brazil, Russia. Russia, after all, is the other main superpower in the world, and often throughout the 20th century been directly compared to the United States and almost everything else. And yet, when we talk about gun control, suddenly it never appears on a list uh, to demonstrate the correlation between restrictive laws and peace and prosperity. The reason for that is very simple. The inclusion of any of these countries will show that they have very restrictive gun laws, usually approaching bans or near bans, and yet they have very high homicide, much higher than the United States. This is true if we talk about Mexico. This is true if we talk about Brazil or Argentina or South Africa uh, or Russia. And I think I can make a very compelling argument, although maybe not a conclusive one, that these states better deserve to be compared to the United States than very tiny, very wealthy, very homogenous European states like Liechtenstein or Luxembourg. The kind of rebuttal that is given to this is like, oh, well, those are not first world countries. It's not immediately clear to me, however, what that even means. That seems to be a somewhat arbitrary distinction that allows you to cherry pick whatever countries you like. If you want to say it has something to do with wealth, why does wealth have something to do with gun control? Why is it that a poor country with a gun ban can't enforce that ban? Um, and why is it that there are so many countries that do have gun bans and very high violence? And if you look at the list of the countries that have the highest gun homicide in the world, it's a whole slew of Latin American countries. You've got Honduras and El Salvador, Jamaica, uh, Colombia, Venezuela. These countries are vastly more violent than the United States, and none of them have NRAs. None of them have uh, large gun cultures or large per capita gun ownership, and they certainly don't have Second Amendments, and yet they're vastly more violent. And at this point, some argument will be made, well, they're very poor, they've experienced lots of economic difficulties, yada, 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 special pleading, special pleading, special pleading. How come the high crime in Jamaica can be explained away on the drug war? Or this has explicitly happened in one of the more famous recent charts going out where Mexico is not included. Well, because Mexico has a drug war. Well, the United States also has a drug war. Why is special pleading not allowed in the case of the United States? We know that most of the homicides in the United States are directly or indirectly related to the drug war, and yet this is not considered uh, a, a sufficient explanation as to why gun homicides are so high in the United States. It must be because of gun restrictions. Of course, there's the counter of this. There are other countries that have relatively liberal gun laws and are relatively peaceful. Canada, Israel, New Zealand, and Switzerland, not to mention Finland, the Czech Republic. These countries have relatively low crime, some places much lower than the United States, and relatively liberal gun laws. Now, if we look at all countries around the world, we don't see any correlation whatsoever. Now, it's not very scientifically or empirically persuasive. It's certainly not a good argument to say, well, I'm just going to cherry pick the countries that advocate or advance the situation that I want and make up some excuse as to why I should only count those and not the others. Special pleading, special pleading, special pleading. And even if we were to grant that, which I have no reason to do, it would still be a case of correlation does not equal causation. And we have good reasons to think, at least as far as we know, that the gun bans in those countries cannot be the causal reason that they have low crime. Now, I won't say that I am familiar with all of these nations or know about all of their crime statistics, but I know about a few of them and I know about the ones that are brought up the most. In the case of the UK, for instance, UK has always had lower homicide than the United States. It's always had lower gun homicide than the United States. This is true even if we go back to a time before either country had any gun restrictions whatsoever, which isn't all that long ago. Before World War I, neither country had substantive gun control. In the UK, sometimes if you wanted to carry a gun concealed, you had to pay a very small fine, a few shillings, but that was it. Any child could go into any store and buy any type of weapon, including military-style rifles, rifles that even today would be called sniper rifles, repeating rifles, even full automatic machine guns. Not that this is particularly common, but it goes into this era. Yet they still have very low crime, much lower than the United States. Over the course of the 20th century, they enacted more and more gun control, but their crime did not go down. It simply stayed very low. Well, if your crime rate is low and you enact gun control and your crime stays low, it's very hard to attribute the reduction in crime to the gun ban because the low crime rates predate the gun ban. This is also true in the case of Australia. Australia did see a decline in gun violence after they enacted a ban. However, they had a decline in gun violence for many years before the ban, going back, I think, 2 or 3 decades. Now, if your trend is to go down and you pass a ban and the trend continues to go down, and in the case of Australia, the trend actually slowed, which I am not saying is because of the ban, I'm just saying that that's what happened, there isn't really any strong evidence that the ban can be attributed to the causing the low gun crime. If we look at the United States itself, since 1990, the United States has every year added millions and millions of modern firearms to the private stock of firearms. Some of these do get destroyed, some of them get lost, some of them get confiscated, but the net increase is several million a year. And if we're talking from 1990 until now, a decent estimate, ballpark, and no one has an exact number, but a ballpark estimate would be that the number of guns has increased around 100 million. If you believe that there is a positive correlation between gun ownership rates and violence, then only one prediction can be made, and that is that the violence in the United States should have increased, and increased considerably since 1990. This has not happened. Violent crime, including murder and including gun homicide, has decreased by 40 to 50% in that amount of time. We are at historic lows in terms of violence. And this is to go back to the Constitution question. You know, the founding fathers may well not have imagined powerful weapons like we have today, semi-automatic rifles over the counter with, super high velocity rounds that are very, very lethal and very, very deadly. And yet, despite the fact that we have vastly more powerful and lethal technology, the homicide rate today is much lower than it was back then. If there's anything the founding fathers could not have foreseen, it would have been that our society would be this peaceful, relatively speaking. That is something I think is a lost on a lot of people. If this was in 1790 or 1800, a large number of these, and assuming we had Facebook back then, many of these Facebook comment wars would end with the two people arguing with each other, going and fighting a duel, shooting each other, possibly killing each other. Not only that, there would be low-level warfare, nearly genocidal warfare going on between citizens and the Native Americans, and sometimes feuding with each other. There would be many more killings at bars and at weddings and all over the place. And I'm not talking about the Wild West. I'm talking about everywhere in the United States. The homicide rate has fallen and fallen and fallen and fallen and fallen to historic lows, and it continues to do so, despite the increasing lethality of firearms. So there is, again, correlation is not equal causation, and there isn't even correlation. If there is a correlation, you would be able to tell me what the correlation is. If there is a perfect correlation, you could say that's 1-to-1. If there's a perfectly inverse relationship, you could say the correlation is 0. If you're going to say that, well, look at these countries, you got to tell me what the correlation is. And you have to defend your data set. You can't just say, well, I'm going to pick these countries and these are the ones. I'm not counting Mexico or Brazil or Russia or China or India or South Africa. And I'm not going to count, I'm going to ignore Switzerland, I'm going to ignore Finland and Czech Republic and Israel and Canada and New Zealand. And I'm going to just assume that all these countries, because they have bans and because they have low crime, that there's a causal relationship there, even though there's no empirical reason to demonstrate that. I'm also going to ignore the fact that the United States has more guns than it's ever had before and is more peaceful than it's been in many, many, many years. Also, I'm going to make no attempt to actually analyze where the crimes happen and why. So this is, I think, unlike the first two, the Constitution argument and the need argument, actually an attempted argument for gun control. However, it's a terrible one. There's no empirical evidence to support it. It doesn't stand up to any scrutiny whatsoever. It's based on sheer ignorance. It's based on people assuming that guns are never used in self-defense or being unable to imagine what other uses they may have and what they're good for. It assumes causation where there's correlation, and it assumes correlation where there is none. I've seen so many videos where people go and it's very snazzily edited together, and we'll go, oh, look at these countries, and they'll have 10 countries or 9 countries. And it's like, you can't just pick those countries, or you have to give a really compelling reason why you're only picking those countries and not the other ones, and say, oh, well, they're rich. Why is that a determining factor in whether or not a gun ban will work or not work? Completely ignored. The reason that they're doing that, by the way, is because the correlation will be gone. As soon as you start charting all these other countries on there, you don't see the United States no longer stands out. You can't make a chart where you have all these low crimes and then the United States. You're going to have a huge chart where there's going to be all these other countries, and then towards the middle, higher up compared to other quote-unquote industrial countries, the United States will be there. But it's always been there. So, that is a very weak argument. It's not very persuasive. And if you're going to tell me that I need to sacrifice my rights, that I need to not engage in some activity that I'd like to engage in that is not going to harm anyone else, then you need a better argument than that. Okay, so the fourth argument is that we need to do something. Now, there's something about this argument that I like. You look at society, many people do, including me, and you say there's problems, there's issues with society, and you want reform, you want change. And I'm very much the same way. I like my society. I think it's great in a lot of ways. I live a very nice life in any historical respect. I'm very satisfied with what I have and what I'm able to do with myself. But that doesn't mean I think it's perfect. It's not utopia, but not even that, it's not optimal. I think that there are changes that could be made that would make things better. And I totally appreciate the people who look at the world and say, yes, even if you accept, if you've gotten this far, okay, maybe there isn't a correlation and maybe there are legitimate reasons to own guns, but Jesus, that's still so many deaths. That's so many deaths. There must be something we can do. Okay, that's an argument that I can have. However, it's knee-jerk and unempirical and illogical to just jump to a conclusion without analyzing that. What is causing these deaths? What is the and the thing is, crime is very complicated. In fact, there isn't one cause. We have most of the gun deaths in the United States are suicides. And this is something that's conflated very often. We hear gun deaths and we're shown these very dramatic images of single lone gunmen going in and slaughtering dozens of innocents. But that is statistically the least common type of gun violence. It's extremely rare. It's extremely rare, and when charted out compared to all the other gun deaths, it doesn't even appear. A large majority, probably 55, 60%, are suicides. Now, there's some evidence that banning or reducing guns will cause some of those people to commit suicide via other means, but they'll still be suicidal. Uh, and it's a very tricky argument to say people who enjoy guns and like using them should not be able to use them because it would be better if suicide people did not have that option and instead, kill themselves by leaping off bridges or asphyxiating themselves. That's not a very compelling argument. If we look at the uh, homicides with guns, most of those, and it's difficult to argue to measure, probably 50 to 70% of those are related to the war on drugs. Now, this is where my reforms come in. I think that's the largest slice that we can deal with, and I think that means we have to seriously look at the war on drugs. If you are really interested in reducing the number of homicides in the United States, it makes perfect sense to address the war on drugs first, not things like assault weapons. Assault weapons kill fewer people every year. Not just assault weapons, rifles. Rifles. So that includes assault weapons, bolt action hunting rifles, target rifles. All rifles kill less people every year than clubs and hammers do. Not even joking. All right. Hands and feet kill more people than those. That is the only sliver that's smaller than that is people who are killed with 50 cals because nobody is killed by 50 cals, as far as I'm aware. It's a very small group, and it's very interesting. If 50 to 70% of the homicides are related to the drug war, which don't use a particular type of gun exclusively, most of that violence is taking place with handguns, especially cheap handguns, some shotguns. Um, the five most common, and this is old, but the FBI publishes the five most common guns used in crime, and four of them are cheap handguns, and one of them is the Mossberg 500, which is one of the most popular 12-gauge shotguns. Um, why aren't, I mean, logically, if we were talking about reducing the number of deaths, wouldn't it make more sense to address this block of deaths and not the tiny sliver? And I think the only kind of explanation to this is that uh, the purpose is not to reduce gun deaths, but to reduce guns. Because, for instance, we have another tragic aspect of our society, something that can be improved about, is the number of people who die in car accidents every year, whether they be alcohol or non-alcohol related. Many more are killed by this method than by guns, and it's a tragedy. And this is something that probably we should not just sit on our laurels and just assume can't be improved upon. Um, some of the people who die in car accidents, though, are killed by high-end Italian sports cars, Lamborghinis, Bugattis, uh, you know, Camaros. Is that an Italian sports car? I don't know. I don't know enough about cars. Now, if some legislator was to come out and say, I'm really, really shocked by all the people who die on our highways. It's horrible. It's terrible. I'm not going to let this go. I'm going to do something about it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ban the import of Lamborghinis and Bugattis and Camaros. I think it would be understood that that person clearly is not really that interested in reducing the number of vehicular deaths on the highways, that he's much more interested for one reason or another in hurting Italian sports cars. Maybe he owns a company that competes with Italian sports cars. Maybe he has a vendetta against Italian sports cars. But clearly the main thrust of his proposal is to hurt them and not reduce the number of deaths on the highway. Similarly, someone who is attacking assault weapons, which are so inconsequential when we talk in terms of the volume of gun deaths, makes no sense. Anyone who's not talking about the war on drugs, but instead talking about assault weapons, they're not primarily interested in reducing crime or gun violence. They're primarily interested in banning guns, because it makes sense in that context to go after the guns that have the fewest proponents, that the fewest people use. The number of people who have handguns or have hunting rifles or have shotguns is a much larger group than the number of people who use semi-automatics, even though that group is millions and millions of people. It would be tens of millions of people for the latter or the former two. So they're politically, in terms of incrementalism, uh, much more doable in terms of or susceptible to assault. Um, and this is again, but these high profile shootings, the ones that are always the instigator for more legislation, are always the instigator for more legislation. These are that's a very different type of crime than a drug deal gone bad, or a drive-by in a turf war, or a jealous lover killing itself. The majority of gun homicides, never mind gun deaths, the majority of which are suicides, are like that. And what might address one of those may not address the other, right? There's nothing that will address them both. The person who is, or people in some cases, who are intent on killing the maximum number of people possible and are going to pre-plan it, this is the event that is the least likely to be stopped. All right, if people are willing to die and want to maximize this and are willing to go to the effort and the planning to work towards it, there's very little you can do. There's nothing you can do to assure that they can't try. There's no. You can ban all guns and say all guns are illegal and all ammunition is illegal and no one can buy and sell and put high penalties, and this can still happen. And this has happened. This has happened in France. This happened in Kenya. People don't remember, but there was a massive 60, 70 people were murdered in a mall in Kenya. Kenya does not have a Second Amendment. Kenya does not have an NRA. They don't allow people to own guns, and yet, um, 4 al-Shabaab terrorists walked in there and killed 60 to 70 people. This happened in Mumbai, India. This happened in France, very, very publicly, and it was in the news for how long? Weeks. And Barack Obama went to France only a week later and said that the United States has mass shootings and other countries don't. And yet, there are people who actually rhetorically believe that, who will spout that. Oh no, like France does not have a Second Amendment. France does not allow people to own semi-automatic weapons, and yet they still have these massive attacks that are much larger than the individual attacks in the United States. Now, people will often accuse gun rights people of saying, "Well, you just don't want to do anything." Well, that depends on who you're talking to. There maybe are gun rights people out there who just don't want to change anything and they're just kind of fatalistic about all of it. But I think that's largely not correct. Most of them would advocate things. They just will advocate things that you don't agree with. For instance, Donald Trump. And I'm not a Donald Trump fan and I'm not going to vote for him. And there's much I could say about him that's bad. He says that we should ban Muslims or deport Muslims. Now, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a good solution. And maybe you don't either. But you can't say it's not a solution. He says that there are Muslim terrorists that are killing people. That's true. I think it's overblown. It's not as common as people think. Um, it's obviously a problem. A religious fundamentalist who's trying to kill people should be, resisted as much as possible. But you can't say he's not proposing something. You can't say, well, I don't agree with what he's going to do, therefore he's not proposing anything. One thing that a lot of gun rights people are bringing up, and this is a point that I never hear counter to, is that these people who want to kill the maximum numbers possible seem very logically to be targeting gun-free zones, areas where guns are banned, victim disarmament zones, or as Larry Pratt has recently called them, safe spaces for killers. You go to a school, you go to a church, you go to a nightclub that bans guns. You go someplace where concealed carry is not allowed. You go someplace where the private property is not going to be garrisoned by people who may or may not have guns. This makes perfect logical sense. In fact, it's very rare that these events occur in places that don't ban guns. The only one that I know of for sure is the Gabby Giffords, which was essentially an assassination attempt. But guns were banned at this nightclub because in Florida, where alcohol is served, you can't have guns. You can't. They had, it's a concealed carry state. It's a revolutionary concealed carry state, but you can't carry guns in a nightclub that serves alcohol. And this guy had to have known that. If now would he still not have gone? It's hard to say, since he wanted to kill gay people, and it sounds like he may have had a personal connection to this club or to this community. That has not all been substantiated yet, so I don't want to speculate too much as to that. But this was a place where guns were banned. And the point is removing the potential for victims to fight back increases their risk. And I know this sounds strange. Like a month before, people may not even believe it, but there's actually video evidence of it. I was meeting some gay friends of mine here in New Hampshire, and they had gotten new, very, very discreet holsters, and they were attempting to find ways to wear them concealed with very, very skimpy clothing. And their argument was very simple. During the day, they walk around either open carrying or concealed carrying, and they basically go everywhere. They go to the bank, they go to the store, when they walk down the street, they always have one with them. But they're gay and they like to go to the clubs. And when they go to the club, they don't want to wear an overcoat or a sweatshirt or the bulky stuff that normally helps you conceal carry a weapon. So they were trying things that would work with much less cover. And to be honest, I thought, well, geez, guys, what are the odds that the nightclub that you're going to get attacked in, that you go to, is going to get attacked? And they understood that the odds were very low, but he's, look, a club is full of people, no one there is armed, it's a target. My life, I'm not going to go there and be a target. There are people who hate gays, there are people who, he didn't cite Islamic terrorism, and these are not guys who are Islamophobes. I don't even think that's what he had in mind. He's like, I'm not going to go there and put my life in the hands of a donut-eating cop who may or may not show up. He's certainly not going to show up in time to, prevent me from getting killed. And although even for me, I felt that was a little paranoid that you would, be, trying to wear them in that situation. Yet it has been borne out to be prescient. That's not that crazy. Again, not very likely of all the clubs in the United States, this is the one that was attacked, and it's the first time. But the logic is very clear. These places are targeted. And many gun rights activists are saying we should not have mandated gun-free zones. Now, there's a private property issue. If private property owners don't want people to go on their private property with guns, I'd say that that's their right. Gun owners don't always agree with that. However, by mandating them, by making them legally necessarily disarmed, it makes it much easier. This guy did not go to an NRA convention. He didn't go to a mall. You just go to a regular mall in Florida. If there's thousands of people in the mall or hundreds of people in the mall, some of those people are going to have handguns because enough people in the state conceal carry that statistically that's very likely. And this is something that a lot of people fail to realize. If you live in a state, and this is most of the states that allow concealed carry, a large enough percentage of the population, and it depends on the state, has licenses and carries regularly. And if you're in a city and you're walking past people all day, every day, you're actually walking past people with concealed carry permits on a regular basis. And you probably are none the wiser of it. However, it's very likely that this has at least a deterrent effect on some types of crime, and this is one of them. So there's that. You can't say that because the solutions people offer are not the solutions you would like, or not solutions that revolve around gun control, that they're not offering a solution. They're just offering a different solution than you. However, their solution actually makes sense. All right, eliminating gun-free zones makes logical sense. Arming yourself against an attack makes sense. If you want to live by the delusion that you can't possibly defend yourself, or that it would never be useful, or the only thing that would result would be collateral damage, then that is delusional. There's too many instances of them being used successfully for you to basically deny that. I mean, people do, and I don't expect people not to, but that's the truth. And you can watch video of it happen. You can, again, go on YouTube and type "guns save lives" and watch videos of people using guns in self-defense. Or you can go on the internet and you can type stories. The only problem is these stories don't make national news. And I'm not saying that they should, but then you don't become aware of them. And it's very easy then to deny them. Uh, when you continue to believe whatever makes you feel better. So there's that. And one kind of related final point. Guns aren't a panacea. They don't may mean that you're invincible or that you can do whatever you want, but they do make a difference. One of the arguments that I haven't touched on, that is the elephant in the room in a lot of sense, especially when we talk about the Second Amendment, is the defense against tyranny. Now, there's very common arguments against this that basically run along two different lines. One, that the government can't be tyrannical because there's democracy. This is very interesting because many of the people who make that argument will also say, sometimes within a few sentences, that Trump is the next Hitler or that Bush was a fascist. But there is no reason to assume that a government can't be tyrannical. And when you have a government that has kill lists, that has no-fly lists, that drone strikes and kills civilians, that admits killing civilians, that engages in war unconstitutionally, that does mass surveillance of its entire population, it's very easy to say that it's at least hypothetically could become tyrannical or despotic. The follow-up argument is that it's hopeless. Defending yourself with a gun against the government could never work, so it's stupid. Well, first of all, that's not an argument either. Say that, let's just accept that it's correct that guns are not an effective way to resist the government. That's not an argument to ban guns. Again, that is an argument contingent on other arguments. That would be eliminating one reason to have guns, but not a reason to ban them. But also, I think that it's also false. Yes, defending yourself with a gun against the government would be very bad. However, that's very, very highly contingent on the scenario. If we have a scenario where you're the only person who rebels and the entire government is bent on killing you, the fact that you have a gun is not going to help you. If you're in a group of 10 guys and you try and go out into the woods and start a rebellion on your own and no one else supports you and the government decides to go after you, that's not very good. If, however, say 2% of the population, so 6 million people, decide they don't like the government, and they don't like the government enough that they're no longer going to cooperate with them, and they are armed, and they're dispersed around the whole country in different places and different cities, what exactly is the government going to do about that? What are they going to do? Are they going to, and people will show diagrams like, here's your gun and look at all the weapons the military has. Like, yeah, and they'll put pictures of like aircraft carriers and ballistic missiles. Like, are they going to fucking nuke like the cities you're in because, there's 20 militiamen in a city with 50,000 people or 1 million people? Is that what they're going to do? Are they going to send 6 million people, let's just say, and that's just an arbitrary number. They don't have 6 million tanks. They don't have 6 million fighter planes. They don't have 6 million aircraft carriers or ships altogether. Are they going to deploy all of them? I mean, sure, if all the people who don't like the government got into the salt flats in Utah and stood out there in a field and had their shotguns like, yeah, we hate you, government, yeah, they get mowed down to pieces. Of course, it would look really bad in the news media, and I don't know how willing the government would be to do that, but that's never how it's going to be, how it pans out. And the other thing is deterrence. A porcupine is never going to kill a lion. Porcupine quills cannot kill a lion. Okay? Never, 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 never. But that doesn't mean that it's irrelevant whether the porcupine has quills or not. They don't get killed by lions very often because it hurts too much. It's not worth the effort. All right? You could say that resisting the government, defeating the government with weapons is futile, but the fact that you can resist can raise the cost of them trying to defeat you, and that can actually dissuade them from doing something. Or you'd be surprised, you might even have a chance. Like, it's very asinine to me to go, let's just use the most cliched example, World War II. And you have the Nazis that are killing all these people, and there are all these populations of people who aren't armed and don't know how to use guns, and they're exterminating them. Are you going to tell me that if 6 million Jews had been armed You know, if they and not even had modern arms, just give them shotguns and hunting rifles. If they would have gone down as easily, they would have at least had the option to resist. And the few that did, in say the Warsaw Ghetto, or in the Pripyat marshes or other areas, the partisans in the east, they were able to resist and stall and delay and thwart Nazi aggression, and in some cases save themselves. And I think it's very odd to be like they should not have been allowed to do that, or that would have been futile. Absolutely not. Now, again, it's highly dependent on the circumstances, what's possible and what's not possible, what is not possible. But to just say it's not going to work, again, no, the fact that you can resist at all makes it less likely that you're going to be aggressed. Shaving a porcupine does not make it any more better off in vis-a-vis getting predation. Removing the quills is not a good idea. Removing the guns is not a good idea on its own. If again you can come up with a compelling reason, if you said, oh, porcupine quills cause cancer and kill the porcupines 100% of the time, yeah, maybe maybe it should take a risk to be eaten by lions, but that's not the case. Porcupines don't get cancer from their own quills, and fucking owning a gun does not cause you to die. It doesn't cause you to become a homicidal maniac. It doesn't make you become a murderer. You know, and here's another very simple logical thing. Any law that people say, but it makes intuitive sense. If we ban them, there'll be less and there'll be less crime. It doesn't work that simple, and here's why. If you ban them, there will be less. You won't be able to get rid of them all, though. And it's going to disproportionately affect the law-abiding people, the people who don't want to break the law, the people who have no intention to become a criminal or a murderer or a killer or a mass shooter or a gangbanger or any of that. They're going to turn theirs in, likely. And the criminals, maybe they'll have a harder time finding them, but they're certainly not going to turn theirs in. They're already in a life of crime. In the case of these high-profile shooters, they're already willing to die, to go to whatever lengths are necessary to do it, to kill the maximum number of people possible. Maybe some of them will be prevented, but some of them will probably still make it through. But now they have the option of realizing everyone else is going to be defenseless, and so they can have open season where before they couldn't. The disproportional effect on the law-abiding peaceful people relative to the criminal malintentious people is why even full-scale bans are not likely to cause net decreases in violence or crime. And that being the case, that the fact that we can't even theoretically um, assert that there's going to be any kind of benefit in any Benthamite sense, and there's certainly no empirical evidence to show this because we have long histories of banning certain types of weapons, of registering weapons, of confiscating weapons. None of these things cause reductions in crime. In the places that had low crime and had these massive gun controls, they already had low crime before the gun controls. So they can't be attributed with causing something that predated their existence. So anyway, I think those are the most common, largest, best arguments for gun control that I've heard. There are others, but they're much more subtle, and almost all of them are related to these. I think all of them are very weak. I think all of them are very poor. Some of them I don't even think are arguments. You know, just stating that the Constitution is antiquated, well, that is not an argument for gun control. That's an argument against the Second Amendment. That's it. Um, and the only one that I think that is an argument, the correlation between countries that ban, is a ridiculously bad argument. So anyway, this video has rambled very long. I wasn't sure how long it was going to take. This has been retread a million times. I enjoy doing it. I think it needs to be done. It's a very, very important issue that touches on many, many different aspects of our society, about human liberty, about philosophy and ethics, and empiricism, and it's one that I never tire of. Um, and here's to hoping that one person changes their mind from seeing this or talking to someone who did see this, but you know, not holding my breath. Anyway, have a good night, and anyone who goes to PorcFest, say hi to me if you see me there.